All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. I think a lot of people are familiar with this one, but it's one of those books where it's good to go back and revisit because it's been really influential. And you sent this in because you want to understand how the wealthy think about money differently.
Yeah, and this is really, I think, Kiyosaki's bread and butter. And
Yeah.
so we have the book itself, the introduction, we have, the first couple of chapters, and we have all that front matter, the acknowledgments, the table of contents, copyright page, the foreword. So our mission here is to really extract the core principles that he's laying down in this book, especially this fundamental difference between assets and liabilities,
Right.
and that mindset shift you need to build wealth.
Okay, so let's jump into this because I think one of the first things that he does right out of the gate is he talks about these two father figures that he had in his life.
Absolutely.
So can you kind of like paint that picture for us? What is the central contrast he's trying to set up there?
Yeah, so you've got the tour dad. He calls him his biological father,
Right.
who, was highly educated, had a PhD. And then you had the rich dad, who was his best friend's father, who didn't even finish the 8th grade,
Oh, wow.
but became very, very wealthy. And so right away, he's setting up this contrast between, formal education, the traditional path, and then this other way of thinking about money. And it's really interesting. Like, one of the quotes he uses is, poor dad always said, the love of money is the root of all evil.
Right.
And then the rich dad flipped that and said, the lack of money is the root of all evil.
Oh, that's a
You know,
good one.
So right away, he's flipping the script. And he also points to, like, the language that they use. Like, poor dad would always say, I can't afford it.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas the rich dad would always ask, how can I afford it?
That's huge.
Yeah.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah. Yeah. So one is a statement that shuts down possibility. The other is a question that opens up solutions.
Totally.
And then also the poor dad, again, very traditional, like study hard, get good grades, get a good job.
It's your job.
Yeah. And then rich dad was like, study hard to buy a good company.
Interesting.
And then the final point, and this is really at the heart of the book, is the poor dad saw his house as his biggest asset.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's what you're told, right?
Right.
And the rich dad actually considered his house a liability.
Hmm. So that leads into one of his big lessons, right?
Yeah.
The rich don't work for money.
Exactly.
So what's the core insight there?
Yeah, and I think the best way to really understand this is through Kiyosaki's stories about his own experiences. So he talks about how, when he was young, he and his best friend Mike tried to make fake nickels,
Right.
which, obviously didn't last very long. And then Mike's dad, the rich dad, offered them work at his convenience store for like 10 cents an hour.
10 cents an hour.
Yeah, and Robert was like, this is terrible. I'm out of here.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is where it gets really interesting because the rich dad was doing this deliberately. Like, he wanted them to feel underpaid.
Really?
Yeah, the lesson was that the rich don't work for money, they have money work for them.
Okay.
And that feeling of being underpaid was supposed to highlight what he calls the rat race,
Yeah.
that cycle of going to work, getting a paycheck, paying bills, and then doing it all over again. And it's driven by this fear, right? Fear of not having enough money, fear of losing your job.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then also by desire, like desire for more money, desire for a bigger house, a nicer car. So he was trying to teach them to understand those emotions so they wouldn't be controlled by them. And so their next business venture was actually using these discarded comic books.
Oh, right. Yeah.
They created a little comic book lending library.
Smart.
Yeah, and so that was their first taste of having money work for them, generating income even when they weren't physically there working.
I like that. That's cool. And so that kind of leads into his second lesson, right? Which is why teach financial literacy. So what's he getting at there? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
Yeah, so he's making the point that it's not about how much money you make, it's about how much you keep.
Right.
And he actually tells this really interesting story about a meeting of incredibly successful businessmen in 1923.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them, they were millionaires, they were at the top of their game, but then years later, many of them ended up financially ruined.
Really?
Yeah. And so his point is that financial intelligence, understanding how money works, how to, make it, manage it, invest it, protect it, that's crucial, especially when things change, because if you don't have that understanding, money can disappear very quickly.
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads into what seems to be like the real foundation of his thinking, which is this difference between an asset and a liability.
Exactly. That is, I think, the most important takeaway from the book.
So can you break that down for us?
Sure. So an asset, very simply, puts money in your pocket.
Okay.
A liability takes money out of your pocket.
Right.
And the rich focus on buying assets.
Okay.
The poor and the middle class often accumulate liabilities.
Interesting. Okay.
And sometimes they even think those liabilities are assets. And the way he really visualizes this is with cash flow diagrams.
Okay. Yeah.
So he shows you, with the poor, the money comes in and it goes right back out.
Right.
Whereas with the rich, the money comes in and it goes into assets that generate more income.
Okay. So give us an example. Like, what's something specific where this really plays out, this difference?
Yeah, so the biggest example, and I think, the one that hits closest to home for a lot of people is your house.
The home.
Right. So Rich Dad considered his house a liability.
Okay.
Because you've got mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, all of these expenses.
They take money out of your pocket every month.
Exactly. It's a constant drain on your cash flow. Now, poor Dad, on the other hand, he saw his home as his greatest investment.
Like his biggest asset.
Yeah, the symbol of security and achievement. And I think that's the conventional wisdom.
Right.
But Kiyosaki's point is that if your house is your only major acquisition, then all of your money's flowing out and you're limited in your ability to invest in things that generate income.
Right.
And you're essentially trapped in that rat race because you have to keep working to cover those expenses.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like the core takeaway here is, like, you really need to be aware of, like, what's an asset and what's a liability.
Yes, that's the fundamental shift. Stop thinking about just working for a salary and start thinking about acquiring assets that generate income.
Yeah.
And it's not just about understanding the mechanics of money. It's also about understanding your emotional reactions to money.
Right. So, like, that fear and greed that we talked about.
Exactly. Because those emotions can really drive your financial decisions and often not in a good way.
Right. Okay. So you, our listener, think about it. Right now, what do you primarily focus on? Assets or liabilities? And what's just one small step that you could take to start making your money work for you? Something that maybe doesn't require, a ton of time or effort, but it's just a step in the right direction. That's your food for thought today. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.